Thank you very much, Natalie. What a joy to be here, and how terrific that you're all here so early, and what a distinguished audience we have. I should say, Your Majesty, and lords, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the demi-paradise of Cliveden. It's such a joy to be at the 5th Literary Festival on this glorious sunny morning, and there couldn't be a more appropriate topic than the monarchy. So originally this was billed as, can the monarchy survive? But events in September, I think, answered that question very, very emphatically. And we couldn't have a more wonderful panel. The incomparable Tina Brown, perhaps the most accomplished magazine editor of our time, Tatler in the 80s, Vanity Fair and the New Yorker, all these magazines turned around, Talk, an amazing television career, fantastic books, the Diana Papers, the Vanity Fair diaries, and the Palace Papers, and broadcasting with me. So we've made a speciality of royal documentaries in the last couple of years, and we were privileged to cover for CBS the funeral of Prince Philip, and also for Majesty. So that was an unforgettable, very sad but very moving 4 hours together on a balcony overlooking Westminster Abbey. Now, Robert, we go back further. I think it's 1994.
Yep.
A tour of the Caribbean with Her Majesty and the Duke, and it was a very onerous assignment, 3 weeks. 3 weeks in the Caribbean, on and off Britannia, on and off the VC-10s.
In the depths of midwinter back home, I know.
It was just a terrible assignment. But you, I think, are perhaps the greatest writer on the modern monarchy. I think not one but 3 books on Her Majesty, each one saying new things. And also, you kindly thank me in each of them. So,
Well, you're very kind.
No, but we often compare notes, and also one of the most renowned associate editors of our era, the Camilla Tominey, who constantly is breaking stories on this topic. I think you've been on the Royal Beat since about 2005.
Correct.
So we beat you by about 30 years.
Yeah. I'm just a baby on this panel.
But I think you've broken lots and lots of stories. I think you counted up the number of public events that the Duchess of Sussex had done. I think you did it.
I think, I mean, the biggest scoop was probably Harry and Meghan being an item. That was a big story at the time.
So you couldn't have a better panel to discuss this astonishing topic. And it really has, it's exactly 5 weeks to the hour since the Accession Council, which we probably all watched on television, which some of you maybe were there in this company. But and it's only 5 weeks and 2 days since the death of Her Majesty. So, and it's probably professionally been among the busiest and most moving periods in our professional lives. Robert, you're the Dimbleby of our era. What have we learnt in the last 5 or 6 weeks about our relationship with the monarchy?
Well, thank you, Wesley. There was actually a real live Dimbleby doing the commentating, so I'll leave it to him. I mean, I think we all were dreading that moment, obviously, and I think at the back of our minds, a lot of us thought that this would possibly be a moment that illustrated perhaps the fragility of our 21st century constitutional monarchy. Actually, it didn't at all. It illustrated, I think, the granite permanence of the monarchy. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of Twitter, but there was one tweet that I did like during that week. The one that someone wrote, I've got a pint of milk in the fridge, it's seen 2 prime ministers and 2 monarchs, and it's still going strong. And the fact that you could switch your head of state and your head of government in the space of 3 days without a shot being fired, without a riot, without a crossword, I thought was absolutely remarkable. I think, in a sense, HM from her celestial throne can look down and think, job well done, actually.
And for those of us who wondered if the British Constitution was a mystery, we've actually kind of seen the majesty of the Constitution. Tina?
Yeah, I do feel very similarly, actually, to Robert. I mean, at the end of my book, The Palace Papers, I reflect, because she was at that point, the Queen was still alive, when she died, I thought there was going to be a collective sort of national identity crisis, a kind of a national nervous breakdown, if you like, when the Queen died. However, it turns out that it was the government that had a nervous breakdown, not, either the people of England or the monarchy. That there was this it was almost as if the Queen, with this brilliantly sort of managed exit of hers, the way she was so, on form to the end. The last we saw of her was of this beautiful sort of twinkling almost picture of her at the end, sort of joyful picture, strangely joyful picture. And then all of a sudden she was gone, but it was in Scotland where she had wanted very much to end her days. It was just such a kind of beautiful end that it actually then, elided beautifully into the ceremonial side of it. And, Charles himself, I think, stepped up so well immediately. And the whole planned, rehearsed, fantastic sequence of days went so immaculately that it was just deeply reassuring at a time when we're living in a very anxious island here. And there was something about that flawlessness and seriousness and beauty that was enormously powerful, I felt.
And did it show that the roots of the monarchy are very profound?
It did. It showed how monarchy absolutely is this distillation of history. And you saw, history in the Constitution, as you say, sort of being dramatized before our eyes. It was like a kind of theatrical display of what the Constitution is, essentially. And in that sense, it was both an education and, a period of mourning.
So, Camilla, you do both politics and the monarchy, so it's been a slightly busy period for you.
It's always been a busy period. It's been really busy since 2016, to be honest. There hasn't really been much let up. I mean, I agree with Tina in that I was predicting more of a kind of collective nervous breakdown following the Queen's death, but I think we're all having collective nervous breakdowns for very many reasons, and therefore a few people were saying last night, isn't it interesting how we have managed to move on quite easily, and that's because that extraordinary 12-day period of mourning showed us that the crown will always endure. But when I put both of the hats on, what I suppose is depressing, particularly in light of recent events, is that when we all sort of thought about the Queen's contribution to public life, this extraordinary and selfless sort of devotion to duty and to the collective national interest, what we're really mourning is the loss of an extraordinary character and a person of character that we probably won't see again in our lifetimes. Comparisons obviously made between different state funerals and thinking about Churchill, but it's quite extraordinary to have a woman who was on the throne for 70 years, who when she dies, no one has got anything bad to say about her at all. And that wasn't because the coverage was overly reverential or indeed sycophantic. It was just because she was a remarkably good woman. And therefore, I think if we're mourning anything, we're mourning, the loss of someone whose like we'll never probably see again. And that is depressing when you compare perhaps the lack of quality in some of our elected representatives at the moment.
So do you have a particular memory that sums her up?
I mean, the extraordinary, why that funeral was almost so cinematic. I mean, if you'd asked Steven Spielberg to sort of come up with the most extraordinary sort of funereal spectacle you've ever seen in your life, what I thought was amazing about that day was the scene in London was just so extraordinarily wide, wasn't it? You were looking at it going, what am I watching here? This is the most extraordinary symbol of pomp and pageantry, which is the crown. And then gradually as the day went on, it got narrower and narrower and narrower, down up the long walk, past her corgis and the horses, to just the sight of her coffin, as her as an individual. You got the display of what it meant to be the crown, but equally what it meant to be her, as the lone piper walked off into the distance. Yeah. That basically tells you everything about how interlaced she was with the institution that she served. So in that regard, I mean, we won't see a funeral like that again, will we, Robert?
No.
So, Robert, do you have thoughts on what the appropriate memorial should be for Her Majesty?
I mean, yes, and I think it took about 10 years before Britain collectively decided on how to commemorate Queen Victoria, for example, with the Queen Victoria Memorial. So I think already, there will be discussions in government. It's got to be a national memorial. I think it'd be very nice if there was an element of public subscription to it. But how do you capture the essence of someone who actually hated being kind of, memorialised? I mean, it was very interesting towards the end of her life, Queen Victoria was always going around unveiling statues of herself all over the place. And I mean, there's a huge one sitting right in front of Windsor Castle. And you go into the grounds and you talk about the funeral. Up, as the coffin came up the long walk, you could just see over the tree line this enormous mausoleum that Victoria erected for herself and Albert. She was very keen on sort of stamping her posthumous mark. The Queen Elizabeth II is complete opposite. There's almost, you have to look very hard to find a statue of her anywhere. There is one in Windsor Great Park.
The marvellous equestrian statue.
Yeah, the equestrian statue.
Queen Anne's Ride.
Yeah, but you've really got to go and look for it. Yeah. I mean, it's not very much on public display because she just thought, all right, if you've got to put it somewhere, put it over there.
But then actually,
and then look at where she's buried.
Yes.
There's no Queen Elizabeth II mausoleum. It doesn't even have a name on it. It's the George VI Memorial Chapel. She wanted to be with her mother and father. That's it. And she so. How do you commemorate someone like that? And I mean, I did think in a sort of idle moment, wouldn't it be wonderful if you had a sort of, I thought after the funeral, you had a sort of enormous statue straddling the River Tweed, rather like the Angel of the North. You could have the Angel of the Union. But then I thought it's not very dignified having the sort of, Colossus of Rhodes picture of the Queen over a river. I don't think she would absolutely have hated that. I always love her remark when she was informed that a neighbouring landowner in Scotland had planted a plantation of trees in his initials. And the Queen was told about this and immediately responded, "How vulgar." So I think what there should be, and I may sound like a sort of stuck record on this because I've now run, I think, 3 campaigns to build a new royal yacht. But I think we should have a new royal yacht. Don't call it a royal yacht. The word yacht upsets people. Call it a national flagship. I know there's sort of meant to be one in the pipeline. Boris kept talking about it as Prime Minister. I suspect it's probably now in the bin. But a proper old-style, Britannia-style, elegant, floating embassy that can go around the world serving this nation like Britannia did brilliantly, more than paying its keep. I mean, absolutely more than paying its keep. It generated so much in trade deals and diplomacy and goodwill and soft power. And I would call it Elizabeth and Philip. Victoria and Albert, I think we should call it the Elizabeth and Philip. That's my memorial.
Okay, Tina.
A memorial, you were saying?
Yes.
I wish there could be a museum of behaviour, because as Camilla said, she is the sort of last decent, discreet, appropriate person in modern life. I too like the idea of this floating. She minded so much when Britannia was decommissioned because it was her happy home. It was actually the only house that she and Philip really got to sort of design for themselves. And it was the only place she could really escape because she couldn't really go abroad, with the family unless they were aboard Britannia. So that it would be a kind of rather lovely sort of giving her back of something that she truly wanted because as Robert says, I mean, to sort of put her in a marble statue is like to kill her. It's a horrible idea somehow for this woman who loved nature and riding. And, I did actually wonder about a marvelous kind of flying horse, some sort of Pegasus creation. But anything that one comes up with like that, you just know she'd find ridiculous. So, yes, floating is certainly the best idea. I
can't see that a boat flying.
Yeah, well, doesn't have to fly as well.
In the present political climate. I think
but you have to. I know, of course, it would not be a popular thing. There would be an outcry, but there's always outcry.
I think
somehow you have to just.
It's doing a very good campaign.
No, I'm going to ask Camilla in a moment, but I think it's going to be parks and gardens and trees. So I know in Regent's Park there's going to be a 2-acre garden where the old nursery was, which is going to be for her. She personally planted 1,500 trees. I think it's 1,000 flowers, 1,000,000 trees, and she kind of launched that towards the end of her life with the canopy.
And she loved lilies so much. You could have a whole kind of forest of lilies,
And I think statues will come. I think there's already going to be one in Romsey and one in Andover. That's just one county. Camilla, what do you think?
Well, I don't understand why the government's dragging its heels on this Elizabeth Day bank holiday. There was a movement while she was still alive to mark the Platinum Jubilee by having what the people behind it, including people like Brendan Cox and Ian Duncan Smith, called a thank holiday, and it was to thank the Queen for her service, but also to thank people who also volunteer and give up their time for nothing to help others. That has now transmorphed into a permanent bank holiday called Elizabeth Day in her honour, and I just think that would be a wonderful way of marking it. The government is dragging its heels, you know, obviously there's concerns in the Treasury about real frippery, like, oh, the paper diaries have already been printed for next year, so we can't possibly have a change and have an extra bank holiday. England and Wales lag behind Scotland and Northern Ireland, who have got 2 more bank holidays than us. And equally, that's a permanent reminder of her importance and significance in British public life.
So I think we should move on to the King, because we're about the Carolean age, we're all Elizabethans, but we're in this new age. Now, one thing he said in that remarkable first speech, talking about his mother, in her life of service, we saw that abiding love of tradition together with that fearless embrace of progress, which have made us great as nations. And I think that's kind of a key both to her and to him, and you've got this delicate balance between the two. And we're going to see this at the coronation, Saturday, May the 6th, so 8 months after his accession, as opposed to 18 months after her accession. And actually a very bold statement from the palace, and then lots of extemporise and lots of rows about crowns and carriages and procession routes. So Tina, what do you think? Is it a celebrity spectacle, a religious occasion?
I think it's actually a much more sort of hazardous thing to design than the funeral. And there is peril there, partly because it's such a long time ahead. It gets all the kind of various factions going about what they think it ought to be. I think it will need, it's almost like you need, you know, a sort of David Olusoga, you know, Stephen Daldry, Duke of Norfolk co-production, where they kind of come together and sort of really talk about the elements of modernity. I'm slightly concerned about this kind of, the sort of mixed metaphor of being, on the one hand, you know, lounge suits, on the other hand, carriages, has a slightly Monty Python worry about it to me, that it could end up being anachronistic in some difficult way. You know, people sort of, peers in lounge suits sort of vivat vivat Rex or something, you know, I mean, it's just...
because you can't really mess about with it that much. It goes back to, I think, King Edgar in the 10th century. Yeah. It's laid down in the Liber Regalis in the 14th century.
And they talk a lot about the slimmed down...
And you've got to have, there are some elements that you've got to have. Many of them are religious elements.
Yes, they are religious. So, I think, you know, the talking too much about the slimmed down is going to overhype that, because it's still going to be, you know, a very ceremonial affair, and should be.
There'll still be the gold state coat.
There'll still be
there'll still be the robes. There'll still be some peers.
There'll still be some peers. And it'll be
what about crowns? So he will wear St Edward's crown, which is very heavy,
I think St Edward's crown is good.
What will Camilla wear?
Well, the interesting thing about the crown is it's also very much changed. I mean, if you look at that famous kind of full-length portrait of King Charles II, he's got this enormous crown on his head. It's like a sort of huge upturned souffle with this velvet, you know, big ballooning bouffant crown. It's very, so they actually do change it quite a lot.
Well, that's one of many crowns,
over the years.
But he actually was crowned with the St Edward's crown, which had to be remade after the Civil War. And so that dates back to 1661, and that doesn't seem to have anything stolen in it.
No, I mean,
they seem to all be kind of indigenous.
Right, they got to stay away from all the colonial pillaging that's gone on over the years. I think Camilla, her crown should be extremely simple. Yes. I mean, I think that will be her instinct. I mean, Camilla's a very sensible woman.
Diadem?
A diadem, I think, would be excellent. The 1820 diadem would be excellent.
Or Queen Adelaide's crown from 1831?
Well, look, there's a bunch of crowns out there. We know we know from the Meghan Markle story that crowns, like there's a whole case of them, and it's pretty difficult to get a hold of them, it seems. But
so basically, ask Angela Kelly.
Ask Angela Kelly. Bring her out. We haven't seen Angela. We need Angela in this mix.
So what Camilla wants, Camilla gets.
There's also the question of what she's called and all of that.
Oh, we'll get to what she's called. Right. So Robert, the coronation.
I think it'll like everything else. It'll be a sort of a mix of old and new. They always evolve. They're always slightly different. I mean, in the run up to the Queen's coronation, there were lots of rows. Every big, great royal event has to have a monumental row in the run up, and then or turns out to be wonderful on the day, and everyone forgets the row. So when Harry married Meghan, in the run up to that, there was a whole row about the father not coming, and actually on the day it was all great. In the run up to William and Kate's wedding, there was a whole row about why is the Syrian ambassador invited, and Tony Blair and Gordon Brown aren't, and various rows about invitations. Charles and Di's wedding, there was rows about invitations. The King of Spain ended up walking out because the honeymoon was kicking off in Gibraltar before Charles and Camilla's wedding. Huge row about where they were going to, they'd forgotten to apply for a wedding licence at Windsor Castle, so they had to go to the town hall. So you've got to have your pre-row. We've got in early with the coronation. We're already debating the Koh-i-Noor. I idly wrote in a piece in the Mail earlier this week that there's probably going to be a row about the coronation oil, because as well as being made of cinnamon and jasmine, it's also made from civet, from the glands of a civet cat, and ambergris, which is from the stomach of a sperm whale. Boy, oh boy! Next day, bing, actually in the same paper.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to get marketed by Chanel somehow. Like
exactly.
So
they were having a row. So I mean, all these things will happen. And cometh the moment, it will be great. It'll be very traditional in parts. We won't see hot and cold running peers. I don't think there will be much ermine. I think it'll be more mourning coats than ermine. But I think while you can tinker with the congregation, and it can't be as big. I mean, the congregation in 8,200, which is four times the current capacity of Westminster Abbey, because they just stuck layer upon layer of scaffolding. Now, I mean, health and safety wouldn't allow that now, and it was pretty uncomfortable.
And the peers kept their lunch in their coronets.
There was one peer when they did the God Save the Queen, they lifted up their coronets. Someone's sandwiches fell out,
they had to have bladders like camels as well.
Well, they had to install chemical loos behind the pillars for the peeresses.
Camilla,
it's not going to be like that.
There will be the Gold State coach, uncomfortable but remarkable. Presumably he will be in ermine. She'll be in ermine. Or?
Shouldn't he be in ermine? It's a coronation. I mean, it's not
As
the
long
final of Strictly Come Dancing. I mean, the public are expecting. What do people think a coronation looks like? It looks like bells and whistles and jewels and crowns and carriages, and that's what the public wants.
Yes.
I get this argument about making it value for money, not only because that's the king's shtick, slimmed down monarchy, not splashing too much cash, and it's probably coming at the end of a very difficult winter for people. But actually, this is what these ceremonies are all about, that the public wants to invest in them. To make it as popular with the public as possible, as with the funeral, you've got to make it as accessible to the public as possible. We saw with the 5-mile long queues and the throngs of people gathering in the Mall and onwards and outwards towards London, that people want to go, they want to see it with their own eyes, they want their children to see it, they want to be able to touch monarchy, and it's going to be a hugely significant event, and therefore, I mean, I don't think it should be on the cheap and losing all of the frills, which are what these sorts of ceremonies are all about.
And it's fantastic for brand Britain and for visitors. So there'll probably be a shorter route. There won't be a 5-mile route. There won't be lots of stands along the route. And do we expect 1 million people?
But he should do a pre-coronation tour. He should take in all four corners of the UK, because if there are people, one of the kind of fortuitous things that happened with the Queen's death is obviously, including Scotland and having that remarkable 6-hour journey through the Highlands and all the rest of it. And there was criticisms, and I know you wrote about it, Robert, why wasn't there this whole train journey that could have taken in many more people and people could have lined the routes? It can't just be, I appreciate from geographical purposes it needs to be London-centric, but somehow I think they need to broaden it out and certainly have a kind of king and queen consort tour of the UK.
And the day itself, the congregation will have to look very different. The congregation will have to look more like modern Britain. You can't get away from the very profound religious elements in the ceremony, the anointing. There may not be a full Anglican communion, though, which was what happened at the end of the... And it'd be interesting whether the anointing is in public or whether it's this personal moment like the Queen had.
Well, it's one of the absolute key moments. You mentioned King Edgar. I mean, it actually goes back to the Bible, and which is a sort of the framework for coronations. You know, you have
Zadok the priest anointed Solomon king.
Bang on.
Yes.
So you have your recognition. Here's the king. You have your your oath, your anointing, and your homage, and those are kind of key elements.
Hard to do that in an hour.
I don't think again. I think it'll be probably somewhere between. I'm going to be around an hour and 3/4, 2 hours, something like that.
Yes.
I didn't hear it. I mean, all through the 10 days after the Queen's death. I mean, there were hours and hours of TV coverage. I didn't hear anyone complain that was too much. I think people will be absolutely glued to this coronation, and if it runs to 2 hours, people won't care as long as the cameras sort of pan around and they get to see all the different bits, because it will be as you say, it's got to look like modern Britain. But I think the Queen herself, she was very concerned with changing the sort of the way that those sort of services looked. And I think, for an example of what it might look like, go to an event that you, Wesley, I know, been to probably more than anyone else in this room, which is the Commonwealth Day observance at the Abbey, which the Queen herself devised. And that showed a complete cross-section, multi-faith, all backgrounds, all communities.
So there'll be prayers from different
sure
different denominations. I think that'll
but
be...
at its core, it has to be a Christian event.
But he will have to swear to uphold the Reformed Protestant religion, which I think people will be surprised, because people forget that he's Supreme Governor of the Church of England, and that's one of the absolutely the key oaths that he swears. Yep. So that'll have to be explained to people. So here's one. There'll be a balcony appearance. So who's on the balcony, Tina? Who should be on the balcony?
A balcony appearance
after the coronation. That'll be, I would have thought, the first balcony appearance of the reign, and that'll be a signifier as to whether we have an inverted commas slimmed down royal family, and will our American friends be on the balcony?
I mean, this slimmed down
your American friends.
Yes, my American friends. Well, the slimmed down monarchy is looking a bit anorexic at the moment. I mean, they're getting slimmer and slimmer. It's happening on its own, right? I kind of miss seeing Harry and Meghan there, to be honest. I mean, I think they sort of need it, you know, for sort of modernity, for the sense of, breadth. I think they kind of need the Sussexes there. I would actually like to see the Sussexes there, because, you know, the Queen was such a wonderfully, in her colourful hats and her colourful suits, there was this marvellous kind of, this feminine centre to this group. And that is actually, it's less appealing without as many.
So she also had pages and ladies in attendance. So I don't know if we'll see those. And how many other members of the royal family will we see?
Well, I don't think you're going to see anyone except the central. I mean,
the
Charles
key
has
four
made,
or the key eight.
Well, I think Charles has made it absolutely clear that with that picture that was taken after the big reception at Buckingham Palace, it was just we four essentially. You know, it was Charles and Camilla, and it was Catherine and William. So he keeps making that point, and the children who everybody adores. I mean, those are the only children other than I've ever followed on Instagram. I mean, you know, Prince George and Charlotte and Louis are adored and will obviously.
So you think it's the core family, but there'll be a succession of appearances. Camilla, you must have inside information on this. You'll have been briefed.
Well, I think actually a lot depends on this forthcoming memoir and whether it's published by the Duke of Sussex, because it depends what tack he now takes with that. Obviously, Charles and William were kind of the main subjects of their ire during the Oprah Winfrey interview, and the Queen was kept completely separate and sort of sacrosanct. If he's going to continue to criticise his father, that's going to be more problematic than it was, because people can sort of take or leave a Prince of Wales, but now he's criticising our king, and people are now a lot more protective of Charles in the same way that they were his mother. So, on one hand, because he included the Sussexes in his King's Address, it seems unthinkable that he would exclude Harry and Meghan. But if Harry and Meghan give him enough reason to ensure that they are once again consigned to non-working royal status, which does put them in more of a back row seat, there's no doubt about it. Yeah. And of course they'll include the Cambridges and the children, because they want to show the public this, continuity of the crown. And they know that the public, he's probably a little bit rueful about the fact that some people do view Charles and Camilla as a sort of sandwich generation. The Edward VII equivalent won't be on the throne for long, and a lot of people are looking much further forward to the reign of William and Kate.
And William is playing a big role, we've been told, in the coronation.
What about Edward and Sophie, Anne and Tim? Will they be on the balcony?
Well, again, you include siblings and then you can't include the Duke of York. And if you don't, I mean, in many ways, actually, there is a correlation with the treatment of the Duke of York and the Sussexes. Somebody was saying to me last week, actually, it was quite convenient during the funeral that they could use the example of, oh, well, the Duke of York isn't wearing the uniform and the Duke of York isn't coming to the state reception because he's a non-working royal, and so are you two, so sorry. Having said that, I thought that the likes of the Princess Royal and the Wessexes played such a blinder during the funeral and, you know, really rose to the occasion and provided their brother with the sort of stability and the support that he needed, that it would seem a little cruel to now push them onto the outside. What is the slimline monarchy if it doesn't include his own working siblings?
So, Tina, you think that the Prince of Wales will have a big role in the coronation, and maybe that's a substitute for him having a problematic investiture in Wales?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, William is not going to have that investiture in Wales. He doesn't want it. I mean, William, of all of them, I think, really understands the need to be a modern royal and he's able to sort of carry it off because it's really, you know, he's of a generation that doesn't want all of that pomp and ceremony. So they're going to have to, what the role he will play in the coronation, I don't know, but we do know it's going to be a big role. We know that everybody wants to see Catherine. So it's all going to be a lot of focus on them, but it's a lot for them to sort of shoulder, essentially. I mean, I think one of the issues that they're having now is just, it can't all be on Catherine, because there's obviously a desire for this kind of, you know, the sort of the glamour factor, if you like, of the sort of public face of royalty. And it's all being sort of borne right now by Catherine, which is why essentially it's, as Camilla said, we're going to have to wait to see what this memoir does, because clearly if he insults them again, they can't be anywhere near it. But I think there is a desire that people liked seeing the brothers walking together. They did like it, and if there was any way to somehow, you know, include that sense, I think it would be kind of desirable. I think it's in Charles's own nature to want to include him.
But if Harry's got a contract and the book is written, and you've written books, your husband was a fantastic publisher, it's quite hard to get out of a contract.
It is. The only thing is that Harry may have one wild card here. I was thinking the other day, he could actually surprise everybody, because he has got a wonderful ghostwriter in J.R. Mouringer. And J.R. Mouringer really is a very good literary writer. And he wrote the biography of the tennis player Agassi, in which he kind of bled on the page. If Harry's book is all about sort of Harry bleeding on the page as a child, we all remember the little red-headed boy, you know, walking behind the coffin, the tremendous pain of all of that childhood. If it's about that, and he's, you know, taken out a lot of the bad stuff that he was probably going to put in about, you know, Camilla, about Charles, about, you know, everybody else, it's possible the book could be a sort of literary triumph. And that I know it's unlikely.
However, literary triumph. Okay.
It could be, because he's got a very good writer working.
I agree with you, Tina. I think that we all come at it from the point of view that he's going to have all these truth bombs, as everyone calls them, about the family. He doesn't need any of that, and I think he knows that. I mean, you know, as a journalist, simply, you know, Harry's account of going to McDonald's with Diana, I mean, that's 2 pages across the mail straight away.
Right,
and
exactly.
You know, Harry, my first day at prep school. I mean, that could, you know, just anything. All the quotidian minor detail is great. So you don't need to lace this thing with sort of, you know, hideous stories about the family. And I don't think he will. I think he'll be extremely harsh on the media. That's a given. Yeah. I think he'll be pretty harsh on a lot of the staff at the palace, at the officials, that sort of thing, and possibly what could be awkward and no one's looked at yet. I think he could be quite harsh on the government. He was very upset with a lot of the defence reforms, military reforms, so he might have a go on that. But I think he'll leave the family alone. That's my hunch.
So some quick-fire titles. So are Harry's children, under the 1917 letters patent of George V, already HRH, Lilibet and Archie?
Golly.
And Prince and Princess.
Well, the letters patent would say yes, in that if those rules are applied, because it was George V who decreed that the grandchildren of the monarch in the male line have the style HRH and the title Prince or Princess. So on the one hand, you might think, oh, well, then in that case, Archie and Lilibet, they're already HRH and Prince and Princess, except that there are lots of other precedents since. For example, the children of the Earl and Countess of Wessex aren't and choose not to be because their parents chose not to be. They're not called Prince. She's not Princess Louise or Prince James. They're not HRH. So, there's a precedent for not doing it. I think particularly given that the Sussexes, the senior, i.e. the Duke and Duchess, don't use HRH, I think it would then be very odd to suddenly announce that their children were HRH when the parents aren't. They've also made a big thing about not using the titles they already have.
The Earl of Dumbarton.
The Earl of Dumbarton. Camilla,
Lady
great
Lilibet.
scoop by Camilla in the paper that they were stopped. They won't allow it to be called.
Dumb.
Yeah, because it's got dumb in it, and they're worried he's going to be teased at school being dummy Dumbarton. It would be very odd in a situation where they've already got titles they don't use for them to then complain that there are more titles for them not to use. If you see what I mean.
But doesn't necessarily mean they won't complain
Yes,
about that.
yeah.
however.
Oh, I know, of course.
I think it
sure.
would be insanity
For them to assert, yes.
insanity. I mean, it already. I mean, HRH anyway. I mean, they don't use it, as you said. You couldn't have an executive produced by HRH. I mean, come on, it's a completely insane.
So unless it's asserted by the king, it's kind of meaningless. And then this other title...
Also, it's sexist, actually, because at the moment, as
Anne's children,
patterns stand,
yes,
there's that, but as the rules stand, even if you abide by George V's 1917 edict, it applies to grandchildren in the male line, not the female line.
Yes,
so, for example, in years to come, as things stand, George and Louis's children would be HRH and Prince and Princess, but Charlotte's wouldn't. So I think the whole thing does need an overhaul.
So the other title, we have a new style and title, which is Camilla the Queen Consort. And no Queen Consort has been officially styled the Queen Consort. And that's what she is in the Anglican Order of Service, in the Court Circular. And then there's a story in your paper today, Camilla, saying that they're wishing for that title not to be used and that she's Queen Camilla, but she's already styled the Queen Consort.
Yes, but that's really kind of a problem of their own making, because in the aftermath of Princess Diana's death, obviously there was this sense that she could not be known as the Princess of Wales, and that equally she would not be accepted as Queen Camilla. And back then she was a bit of a public hate figure and sort of public enemy number one in the press, and no wonder. And then gradually over the course of time, as she became more accepted and indeed helped to rehabilitate the then Prince of Wales's image, it was decided that actually the public would warm to the idea of Queen Camilla. We obviously had that very prescient and very planned and very premeditated intervention from the Queen, who may or may have known that perhaps her days were numbered in saying that she would like it for her daughter-in-law, who had supported her son so stalwartly, to be known as Queen Consort. But actually on paper it's always Queen Camilla, like it was Queen Mary or Queen Alexandra or indeed Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Therefore, a pitch-rolling exercise certainly went on with members of the media with regard to whether they felt that readers would accept the idea of Queen Camilla, and I think the feedback was that they would. So it's almost a matter of style. I mean, in the paper we're calling her occasionally Queen Camilla, occasionally the Queen Consort, but I think it's almost a matter of public parlance. And does anyone really care whether it's Queen Consort or Queen Camilla?
We
Right?
called Diana
I
Princess
think,
Diana for years, and she never was Princess Diana at all.
Camilla,
I think all
Tina.
all second wives should be called Queen. You know, I like it.
So that would make you a queen.
Exactly. That's what I'm really hankered for it for a long time.
Yes,
Very happy it's now
yes.
being accepted. You know, look, it's just about parlance. To be quite honest, I got a complete jolt the first time I heard the words King Charles III. I think we all did. Oh my God, you know, Her Majesty's only just, you know, died, and we're saying, as we should, you know, King Charles III. So that was a jolt. Now, hey,
So
it's
there's
King
a whole
Charles.
new grammar of new words
Yes.
like catafalque,
Yeah.
which is the most marvellous word.
It's a great word, catapult.
Scepter and orb. And so
This does pass Americans by the
But
way.
Camilla was a word that worried Clarence House in the old days. and they thought that Camilla in itself had bad associations.
I don't know about that. I think that possibly there was a sense that, you know, it's so associated with sort of headlines and sort of journalistic jargon. The Queen Consort, it's a title that explains what she's there for. I think it gives sort of added gravitas. As you know, talking about Queen Camilla, as Camilla says, is totally correct. I mean, it's correct to call her Queen Camilla, it's correct to call her the Queen, and it's correct to call her the Queen Consort. But I think they want to sort of stick it in all the official rubric and you know, the Anglican Order of Service now. There it is. She's the Queen Consort. It's in all the ceremonial. Because I think it does, at a time when you're trying to establish the sort of the permanence and the gravitas and the authority of a new reign, I just think it gives more of a sense of a solidity to say Queen Consort than Queen Camilla.
Now, in terms of the monarchy's global role, there's two aspects. There's that soft power aspect, which you'll know about in the States, but then there's this very serious thing that the Commonwealth, which means a lot to me, and you and I have been with the Queen in Commonwealth countries and saw how much it meant to her, and how in an earlier era there were lots of issues that somehow weren't controversial, that should now boiled up. So Charles has very much asserted he's got a message to the realms and lifelong service to the realms, and obviously there's this constant need to disentangle the 53 odd members of the Commonwealth and the 15 realms, and that they're different. And that, so how do you think he's going to deal with that? I mean, will there be an initiative? Will there be softly? Will he say to Australia, I give in? What's going to happen?
He's already said to Australia, I mean, he made a very important and powerful speech back in 1994, just as the Republican debate was getting off the ground in Australia, in which he said, look, it's down to you. It's absolutely your call. It's not a talent show. We're here at your service. Unfortunately, that speech got completely overshadowed because it was the same day that a madman ran at him when he was giving out prizes with a starting pistol and fired shots at him. So that took his speach off the front page.
And then in Barbados,
but he then made a similar speech on Barbados, and he said time and again, we are there as because you want us there. I think one thing that's often overlooked when these debates about, and we saw it in Barbados, and we saw it a bit when the Cambridges went to the Caribbean earlier this year, and everyone had to go at them saying, oh, look at them, isn't it ridiculous? Time for these countries to rise up and be independent. I mean, all these countries have been independent for years. I mean, Jamaica is as independent today as it was on Independence Day in 1962. And at that point, Jamaica chose to keep the Queen as head of state. So in effect, she's sort of there by invitation. So I think some of the tone of this debate, it seems a bit rich to sort of say, well, you know, will you be our head of state? And then turn around 50 years later and go, what the hell are you doing here?
And in Jamaica, they need a referendum.
They need a referendum.
And Jamaica, of course, is very committed to the Commonwealth at the same time as the Prime Minister was saying that. He was putting up his Foreign Secretary to be Secretary General of the Commonwealth. So I think that people don't understand.
No, you're absolutely right. People confuse. They're within the Commonwealth. It's 56 now, actually. I'm going to a flag-raising ceremony next week for Gabon. Their flag is going up at Marlborough House. The French are furious.
Which was never...
because they're never one of ours.
And it was never one of ours. You need to be careful.
Sorry. Well, no, I mean, you know what I mean. I mean, it was never part of... It was never a British territory.
So there are three members of the Commonwealth which were never in the Empire.
More, because Togo's just joined us. Another French one. Macron is not happy. There are defections breaking out.
Rwanda and Cameroon.
And Mozambique.
And
Angola is on the waiting list.
So this idea that...
It's not a sort of, imperial hangover.
So this idea that Americans have, that it's the colonialism continuing...
Well, I mean, they don't understand the difference between the sort of the Commonwealth as this sort of club of friendship nations and the colonial realms. They just don't, and they also don't understand the difference between the sovereign realms. So they get all completely confused and feel that it's all mixed up, as Robert said, that it's much more about invitation. And I think, Charles has made it clear that he's sort of relaxed about the fact that whatever people choose to do, they can. There's also the fact that because they need referendums, these countries, to change it, it's like, very often they don't want to waste that kind of political...
In Canada, it's just not going to happen, is it?
Well, they don't want to waste all that political capital and time on that issue. It doesn't really... It's not an issue until the people themselves sort of rise up and say, we want it out.
So the Commonwealth continues as a mutual association, and then separately, how do you fill a gap like Elizabeth? Does he still have clout in terms of Britain's soft power?
But I was just going to say about the referendum issue. Of course, Barbados didn't have a
No,
referendum.
they didn't need it
so
up.
it was actually quite anti-democratic, because you
Well,
had
it
a
was-
political party deciding for the public, and they didn't have a say. And then
They
it
didn't
was...
have an election for the
Well, it
president.
was a majority in Parliament.
It was a majority in
but-
Parliament, but, you know, I haven't been on a royal tour to the Caribbean where there haven't been some protesters
Yes.
and then huge numbers of crowds shouting royals' names. I think there's an acceptance, as Tina and Robert have said, by the King, that, you know, he can't force people in, but the popularity of membership of the Commonwealth, as we've pointed out, is growing. You know, a lot of countries are seeing it as a good club to be in, not least with the kind of rise of Russia and China. And I think the other thing about it is, when it comes to William and Kate and the criticisms of the Caribbean tour, the mistake that the royals sometimes make, and particularly people in the royal household, is they look at these tours and they say, right, what did we do last time? Let's do that again. So you have this scene where you have William and Kate, you know, on the back of a Land Rover in uniform, sort of standing up as the Queen and Prince Philip did in a bygone era. What was acceptable for the Queen and Prince Philip isn't necessarily acceptable for modern royals in 2022. So they've got to, there was this briefing that, you know, William was going to abandon the sort of never explain, never complain mantra. I don't think he's going to do that, but I think he understands the need to leave less unsaid. That he and Kate have got to have conversations with people who actually look at this and think, oh, that looks a bit kind of outdated and a bit of a kind of a throwback to our colonial past. Let's do things a bit differently. If they'd had any PR savviness around that particular event, they should have had William and Kate driving the Land Rover and the Prime Minister and his wife on the back of it. You know, that would have been a better look.
But one thing about the Commonwealth, though, is you know, Wesley, you and I, we've all covered Commonwealth summits, and they always argue about absolutely everything. One issue on which there was absolutely no argument, it was unanimous, in 2018 was the decision to make Charles the next head of the Commonwealth. That was a given. Nobody objected to that. So he's all through his life, he's had a very close connection with it. I remember going to hearing a speech by him when the first time he represented the Queen at a Commonwealth summit in Sri Lanka. And it was a very clever speech because he just stood up, no notes, and he just started reminiscing about his experiences of the Commonwealth and talked about how he remembered meeting Nkrumah as a little boy and all these, and water skiing with Dom Mintoff. And suddenly you saw the bubbles and all the leaders around there and go, oh my God, this guy knows the Commonwealth. You know, he knew all the founding fathers of the Commonwealth, and nobody else in the Commonwealth does. So he already comes at it, even though in his first few weeks as king and as head of the Commonwealth, he comes at it with immense authority. I think he's in the right place.
So he's able to exercise soft power without necessarily even saying things, as we might see on the climate change issue. He didn't really need to go to COP, but let's not discuss that. But in terms of his domestic role, obviously he can't be an activist, but he presumably is in favour of the union, and we saw that with his tour. So how will he exercise, if it's appropriate, soft power at home, or do we have to stay as a disguised republic?
I actually don't agree that he shouldn't be allowed to sort of stand for the things he believes in. I mean, you know, there's no reason why conservation of the planet has to be politicized. I mean, I think he should have gone to COP, as a matter of fact. I think that he could have made a great sort of opening speech about those issues, but not talk about, you know, policy or carbon taxes, or, you know, not get into any of the nitty-gritty, which is controversial, but to simply talk about the need, you know, to preserve the environment and our planet. And that's the stuff he's always believed in, and he should be allowed to say it. I don't think he has to follow an attempt to be inscrutable as the Queen. I think it doesn't suit him, and I think that, you know, being a person who stands for certain things, you know, it's simply about common decency, then I think he does it very, very well. And it's much more authentic for him to do that than it is for him to pretend he's a person who doesn't feel anything about the things he's always felt.
And does the United Kingdom survive?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, he is the sort of the monarchy in the armed forces, and I might say other institutions like the BBC. They're the sort of glue that hold it together. But I think what we've seen is actually in recent weeks that the union is in rather better shape than we thought. And I think how they incorporate things like the coronation. I think that's very important. People forget that when after the last coronation, the Queen then went up to Scotland sometime later to receive the honours of Scotland, and she wasn't in her robes. She was in day dress because she thought the Scots might be upset if she turned up in all the ermine and everything else. And the Scots were actually terribly upset and wanted to see all that. So, and it was very interesting during in the days after the Queen's death, and I was in Edinburgh for that, and I went to the service at St Giles Cathedral. And there was the Scottish crown on the coffin, and it was very powerful. And the sight of the funeral coming through the sort of back lanes of Aberdeenshire, and then through the glens, and then gradually the towns, and then the cities. It was fabulous, and Scotland was very proud of its role in that. So no, I think the United Kingdom, the U is there for keeps.
But might we all be being very glossy because what's happened in recent weeks has been so powerful? The Republicans out there, as they have the right to be, Camilla.
No, but if you think about what the monarchy has been faced with over the course of the last 2 years, and the sort of post-Oprah era, and being accused of being racist, and actually what happened is that in this country anyway, the monarchy's popularity went up and Harry and Meghan's went down, because people are protective of the institution and those in it who most people think are doing their best. You can't put the genie back in the bottle that is Charles having been quite outspoken as the longest serving heir apparent in history. Nobody would necessarily be surprised by any of his views now, but it was always said that he wouldn't be the same as king as he was as Prince of Wales. However, I think people reacted quite well to the emotion that he showed in the King's address. I mean, that wasn't just by head of state, but also as a loving son who had lost his mother. And he spoke for the nation in that moment. I thought people really connected with him and felt really reassured by him. He is an emotional man. He isn't like his mother. He wears his heart on his sleeve. Now, obviously, we don't want him to get into the sort of Sussex mode of oversharing. But I don't think there's anything wrong with him being in tune with his emotions and speaking passionately about issues, as Tina says, if they can maintain a degree of impartiality and arguing for decency in public life, or indeed for people to be mindful of conservation issues, or to kind of call for world peace in the advent of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, are all perfectly safe subjects for him to riff upon.
Although I don't think he doesn't need to go to COP, because he almost created COP. I mean, I was at COP with him in Glasgow last year, and everyone wanted to come and see him just to say thank you, because they're all conscious of the fact that he held a summit that led to the Earth Summit in Rio that led to COP1, and here we are on COP26. So he's like the sort of grandfather of COP, and I was there when Joe Biden came up to him, hugged him and said, if it wasn't for you, we wouldn't be here. So I think we can take his views and his position and his stature on that as read.
But a lot of people won't go to COP because he isn't going to be going.
Well, I think for his first overseas visit as king, I think it would look wrong.
And what this proves is that we could go on discussing this for some time, but unfortunately we can't. But I think you've got the opportunity to get books signed by these two magnificent authors. Camilla and I haven't yet produced long form.
Yeah, I've produced 3 children in the last 13 years. That's why I haven't written a book.
And I've done years and years of talking. But what this event shows is that it's better to be talked about than not talked about, and that this ancient institution, I think he's the 61st monarch of England, going back to Egbert.
And he 40, we can forget about Egbert. He's 41 since winning the Conquest.
So he'll be the 42nd to be crowned at the Abbey?
No, there were 2, Edward VIII and Edward V.
Okay,
the 39th, I think.
I think it's 41st, but there you go.
I'll wager with you on that.
But we'll continue this discussion in the green room. But I think it's been very elucidating and a marvellous start to the festival, and a great thing to have at Cliveden, visited by every monarch since George I. And Natalie.
Yeah, that was amazing.
Okay.
The audience can ask some questions.
Yeah, okay, yes. So I'm glad that we've been extended. Sir, questions from the audience. First of all, sir, if you want to say who you are, you can. If you're king or...
I'm from Canada. Is this on? Yes, I'm from Canada.
Yes, sir.
We used to be called the Senior Dominion.
Yes.
I live near Montreal. Nous y vivons en français. I don't think we should totally rule out a reaction in Canada, as we might see in Australia, to the change in monarch. The monarch is still our head of state, but that is not a permanent given. The big question in all of the countries, the realms where the monarch is the head of state, is what is the alternative? And that's why we didn't see a change in Australia. And we haven't come up with a good alternative anywhere else. So I think that's a good thing.
And in Canada, you'd need a majority nationally and in every one of the provinces and you'd open the Quebec issue.
Absolutely, and that's impossible to happen. But nevertheless, the Republican sentiment is there.
Yes, well, as it has a right to be. Anyone want to quickly comment on that?
It's very interesting you raise Canada because, I mean, when you look at the Queen's reign as a whole, there are always periods when this issue pops up in different places at different times. In the 60s, Canada was a big worry for the monarchy. It was separatism and republicanism led to a real increase in the number of visits the Queen went, and there were riots in Montreal, you probably remember, and I mean it was pretty ugly. And then everyone thought, well, Canada, it's over. And then Watergate happened, and suddenly Canada realised, woke up, thought, well, actually, maybe it's not so bad to have a monarchy after all. Look what's happening over the border. And the issue then moved on. Suddenly, Britain joined the common market, and it was Australia and New Zealand who got very upset about what Britain was doing. And republicanism kicked off in Australia, and it became a dominant theme there up through the 70s, 80s, 90s, till the Australian referendum. And now it's happening in the Caribbean. So at any given point, there's always part of the world, within the realms, there's somewhere that's saying, I think it may be time to move on. But I like you, I think Canada really will say, look, what's the alternative? And
by the way, the perks of being in the Commonwealth Club were clear in the Abbey when Justin Trudeau had a better seat than Joe Biden. The only time that's ever happened, and America was quite.
Biden was in the sixth row.
Weddings as well.
Biden was in the sixth row, I think, wasn't he? And Trump made something of it. Trump said he would have been in the front row.
Right. Trump is already writing memos saying that I want a funeral like that, but better.
So more questions. Please put your hand up and a microphone will come to you. I'm sure I saw some hands. We must have not just Canadian questions. Anyone? You have another question.
Well, I can tell.
Yeah.
I can tell a very brief
Yes.
Canadian story about Her Majesty, which I heard from
Yes.
Jean Sauvé, who was our Governor General. When Jean Sauvé met the Queen, they had a little tete-a-tete,
Yes.
and the Queen told Jean about their first days in Buckingham Palace shortly after the wedding, and she and Prince Philip stayed up all night rearranging one of the rooms, and they went to bed quite tired out. And when they got up in the morning, everything had been put back in the place it was.
that's why she loved Britannia so much.
Yeah.
It was her design. Yeah.
Now, that's a wonderful story. Anybody else? This is your last moment, but I'm sure you can... Natalie.
Who do you think is best placed to write the biography of Queen Elizabeth?
I mean,
Hardman.
Robert already has written 3.
would it be a Sean Cross again?
And your book will be out at Christmas, so could a composite be produced?
The only book I want to read is Camilla's. She has it all, but she won't tell it.
But don't we want to read... The Queen has kept a diary.
Yeah.
Every night, before saying her prayers, she's written in her diary.
Half a page in her own hand.
That's the book.
Yeah. I mean, that's...
I feel that we should say Lord Roberts.
I think your founder president,
Lord
Roberts,
should do the honours.
Yeah. Lord Roberts is definitely the
Definitely Lord Roberts.
So, final chance to ask a question. Sir, your microphone is coming to you.
Thank you. I'm Andy Trotman. I wonder what you think is the biggest mistake of Queen Elizabeth's reign?
Good question. Camilla.
I'm going to say it in the context of I think it was one of the greatest moments of sort of redemption from a bad mistake. And we can all think of that dreadful week after Diana, Princess of Wales, died, and her not coming back down to Balmoral. And actually that address, that televised address, as your queen and as a grandmother, and her ability to listen to advice and execute it in such swift succession, even though personally she probably felt that she had done the right thing throughout, and we now reflect that she was trying to do the right thing. And even now, because we've heard from Prince Harry how uncomfortable he found it to walk behind his mother's coffin, actually that was one of the worst weeks for the Queen, but ended up being one of the best.
It was really the only mistake, essentially, of her reign. I mean, everything else was kind of smaller. Obviously, being walked down the aisle at the memorial for Philip by Andrew was not her finest moment.
Well,
but we can forgive her.
Andrew's mistake
But we
than
can
hers,
forget absolutely because it was a personal
And she,
It's for Philip, and she, as you say, he hijacked the situation. So
she regretted not going to Aberfan quicker than she did.
Robert.
Well, actually, Aberfan is always cited as a great mistake. At the time, no one saw it as a mistake.
Yeah.
It was announced at the time she's going on a particular day. No one said that's too late. I think that's sort of after the event. I mean, when I was writing my book, I was sort of constantly looking for, where's she gone wrong? And one thing she never did, she's never panicked. She never rushed into judgment. You could argue, certainly, that there were moments where she took too long to make decisions. Diana Week, for example, as Camilla mentioned. Although I think at the time her priority then was looking after the boys. It wasn't, worrying about flags on flagpoles.
As William recently said, how she was there in the toughest time of his life. He actually said that in his statement after she died.
And I think maybe an overindulgence of as we've seen with the Duke of York. I mean, his career as a roving ambassador, and I mean, particularly after everybody knew that he was sort of, having meetings with Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, that should have been nailed on the head long before.
So she may not have been a perfect mother.
Well,
but who
none
is?
of us are perfect parents. I
Yeah.
mean, I think she was a very good mother. But I mean, in the course of the longest reign in history, you're going to have, you're going to have mistakes. Maybe she should. I think in the earlier part of the reign, I think there was too much deference to her politicians and to her advisors, and you suddenly see she finds a sort of confidence towards the end of the 60s. And suddenly starts sort of making her own mark. But up until then, when prime ministers said, "Oh, you've got to appoint a new prime minister," instead of saying, "Well, you go and sort this out. I don't want to do it," she allowed Churchill. I think, and you can understand. She's 25. He's a great statesman.
I mean, she couldn't expect her at that age to have that kind of confidence.
Exactly. So is that a fault? I don't know. But
should she have stopped Mr. Johnson proroguing Parliament for so long?
Well, she took legal advice on that, and the legal advice was it's perfectly correct to prorogue Parliament. So she did what she should do, which is constitutional monarch. She checked it out and she followed the advice of her elected prime minister. However, of course, I mean, people would debate that and say, well, that shows that monarchy doesn't really matter because politicians can do what they like. But yeah, I mean, she throughout her reign, she was very much, she made everybody conscious that they had to behave around her. I mean, I thought it was her last state visitor. You mentioned Donald Trump. Her last state visitor was Donald Trump. He came in 2019. And then, because of COVID, there weren't any more state visits. And I covered that very closely, and Camilla was there as well. And it was fascinating to see Trump coming in, tweeting away, slagging off the Mayor of London. As soon as he got to the palace, radio silence. Good as gold all week, all the 3 days he was there. No tweeting. And we watched the Queen showing him around the sort of exhibition in the picture gallery, just waiting for some sort of blunder. And he didn't, did he? He just absolutely
Why we need the Museum of Behaviour. Everybody behaved themselves around her as well.
Even North Korea sent its condolences. So I mean, she really was.
One more final thought on that. It might have been a mistake. I don't know what you think, Robert and Tina, for her to have caved in on Prince Charles and the Duke of York pushing Lord Geit out of his role as her
because
private
a lot
secretary.
unravelled with that decision.
He was an extremely intellectual man, could see around corners, very forward-thinking, very dynamic in his thinking. And you could say that had he been at the helm during Megxit, that it might not have unravelled exactly as it did, and it could have been handled better, perhaps.
So what we're really saying, though, is that the only mistakes she really made were when, family and her role just collided in ways that just made it very, very difficult.
Yes.
And it's precious little in 70 years.
But she did have a remarkable ability to flex under pressure. I was there the day she got out of the car after that, and that I've never seen such actual personal bravery, because no one had any idea what the crowds would be like, and it had been quite hostile, and we weren't expecting the car to stop, and you felt the mood of the crowd change. It was astonishing, and no obvious security. She often, remember those Caribbean tours, no obvious security. She was actually a very brave person.
Yes.
And very energetic, and just what a prodigious legacy. But it sounds from the discussion today as though we think that her legacy is in good hands. And it may be. In the 19th century, they said that the cabinet was the efficient part of the constitution and the monarchy was the dignified. But maybe the monarchy is now the efficient part of the constitution as well.
It certainly is still
but
dignified.
It's been so elucidating, and I hope we'll continue. But thank you very much to this marvellous panel.